Welcome back to token-based authentication. In this lesson, we will cover User Logout. This entails adding to our user interface. We will add a logout button. When that button is clicked, we will clear out our user data and then redirect our user using View Router. Let's begin. We'll start by adding that logout button to our interface, specifically within our app nav component. Below the login router link, we'll add that button. And we'll say v-else because we want to display it when we are not displaying the login button. We will add a class of logout button, and then an @click handler, which will trigger the logout method, which for now, we'll just add a console log which says logged out. So now checking this in the browser when we log in, we now see that logout button, and when we click it, we see that console log. Perfect. But when we click this, we actually want to log the user out, which entails reversing the steps we took when we logged the user in. So let's make that happen. We'll achieve this by adding that behavior into Vuex. So our logout method will say this.store.dispatch. It will dispatch the logout action, which we will add now. That action will take in commit. It will commit the clear user data mutation. And we can get an idea for what it needs to do by looking at the set user data mutation. So in order to reverse this, first we could pass in the state, and then clear our user state, setting it to null. Then we'll need to clear the local storage, so we will remove the item by the name of user. And then we need to clear the Axios header, taking that JWT token out of it. Now this should work fine, but there's actually a more scalable and succinct solution for this. So let's take a look at that. Instead of clearing all of this out manually, we can delete lines 22 and 20. We can also take out the state here and instead simply say location.reload. And as this tip shows, this reloads the current page. In other words, it forces a refresh of our page. And since the Vuex state and Axios header settings aren't going to survive that refresh, this will handle clearing out that information for us. The reason this is a more scalable solution is because as our application grows, our store might be broken up into modules, which each have state that needs to be cleared out when our user is logged out. So just forcing that refresh accomplishes all of that at once. Now checking this out in the browser, we see that the events disappear and we see the loading events message. And we see this 401 error in the console. That's because we're still on this dashboard route, which makes an API call for those private resources, but we don't have that proper key to retrieve the resources. So instead, we get this 401 status code. When a user logs out, they shouldn't be allowed to view this dashboard route because they don't even have the permissions to access those events. So how do we fix this problem? Let's head back into our code, where we'll be adding a navigation guard inside of our router.js file. We'll scroll down to our dashboard route and add the meta property. On here, we'll say requires auth and set it to true. The meta property allows us to add custom attributes to the route, such as whether it needs authentication or not. We'll use this in a moment inside of our global navigation guard, which we'll write by saying router.beforeach, which takes in 3 arguments: the route we're navigating to, away from, and next, which must be called to resolve this function. Inside of here, we're going to check if our user is logged in or not, and we'll store that in a const called logged in, which will go into our local storage and get the item by the name of user. Now here, we need to check if any of the routes that match our to routes contain the meta property requires auth. We will say if the to route, then we'll say matched, which will give us an array of the records that match that to route. Then we're using the sum method to iterate over that collection of routes to see if one or more of them has a meta.requiresAuth property on it. So if our route requires authentication, and if our user is not logged in, we know that we need to redirect them to our home page so that they can either log in or create an account. We do that by calling the next function and redirecting them to the root route. Otherwise, if our route requires auth and we do have a logged in user, we'll call next, which tells our router to continue navigating to the to route. And finally, we'll add another else statement, which calls next when the to route doesn't require any authentication. There's a lot going on here, and I was confused at first too, so if you need more clarity, the View Router docs are linked below. Now, if you're looking at all this and wondering, couldn't this be done with less code? You're right, so let's refactor this in a simpler way. So we can take this not logged in and move it up into this if statement, and then delete this remaining code. And what we're left with is the next on line 42, which redirects our user to the home page, and line 44, which just continues navigation. Now let's check this out in the browser. We hit log out, and we are logged out and redirected to the home page. Perfect. If we try to navigate to the dashboard, we can see that we are indeed guarded from accessing that route and redirected to the home page. But notice we still have this dashboard router link in our nav bar. We have no use for that if we're not logged in, so the last step in this lesson is to hide that. Back in our app, we will hide the dashboard link whenever a user is not logged in. So in our app nav component, we will add the if and then logged in. Now checking this out in the browser, since we are not logged in, we're not seeing that dashboard link. When we do log in, there it is appearing. Perfect. That brings us to the end of the lesson. To review, we added a logout button to our app nav component. We cleared out our user data from our app, and then we added a navigation guard to redirect our user upon logout. We'll see you in the next lesson where we look at handling invalid login attempts. Otherwise, if our no, this is going to work for us. But we can do it differently.
Just when you thought this couldn't get more complex.